If you haven't watched parts 1, 2, and 3 of this video series, links should be appearing on screen momentarily. I'd suggest watching them all because it will explain how we got here and also helps the channel. Part 1 explores the scope and the methodology I've been utilizing in examining the text. Part 2 represents an overview of the development of the Shinra Company within the world of Final Fantasy VII up to when the main narrative of the game begins. And Part 3 looks at the activities of the Shinra during the narrative of the game itself. This is going to be a long one, comrades, but for those of you who've already come this far, you ought to know by now, there ain't no getting off of the train we're on. Part 1. I told you we'd get to Cait. Cait, and yes, I am pronouncing it correctly, as it is a Gaelic term meaning fairy cat, is introduced to the party during their exploration of the Gold Saucer. He presents himself as a goofy fortune teller who literally forces his way into the party. Perhaps if the game didn't operate on some fuzzy JRPG logic at times, this would have been an early red flag. Shortly thereafter, the party stumbles upon the scene of a massacre, and instead of trying to explain the situation, Cait tells you to run. Your party is eventually captured, and some events play out I'll be discussing later. Anyway, once you are clear of the Gold Saucer area, you have the option to visit the village of Gungaga, which I talked about at length in Part 2. There to greet you are the Turks, and a boss fight ensues. Afterward, your party questions how the Turks knew you would be there, and Cloud shuts down the idea of there being a spy. The truth of the matter isn't revealed until the party returns to the Gold Saucer and catch Cait in the act of stealing the keystone to the Temple of the Ancients. They pursue but ultimately fail to stop him, and he gives the keystone to Seng. After the revelation that he is a robot being controlled by someone from Shinra, he leverages the safety of Elmira and Marlene, who he holds as hostages, in order to continue his duties as a spy. Cait's modus operandi could have come straight out of the FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, which officially ran from 1956 to 1971. The program targeted any and all organized domestic threats to the established capitalist order. Perhaps most infamously, the Black Panther Party was targeted from 1968 to 1971. The stated goals of COINTELPRO was the disruption and dissolution of any targeted group, and the methodology used ranged from fostering anti-organizational sentiment, to wiretapping, to false arrests, and even outright murder. One of the most successful methods involved infiltration of the target organization, either through relying on informants or having undercover police integrate themselves into the organizational structure. This way, a steady stream of information could be fed to the FBI to enhance their counter-organization efforts. It's some really evil stuff that destroyed countless lives both directly through the judicial system, as well as more broadly through the destruction of any effective opposition to the capitalist hegemony. And no, this isn't predicated on some kind of tinfoil hat conspiracy. COINTELPRO is a matter of public record. Cait Mark I is destroyed while obtaining the Black Materia, and this is where things really go off the rails for me. The entire event is portrayed as his atonement for being a spy, but, and I cannot stress this enough, he is a toy. A toy. He's a robotic fairy cat who is so utterly disposable he is replaced within minutes of the destruction of Mark I. But the developers want you to feel so bad about what happens to him. Look at the noble hero sacrificing himself. Witness his redemption arc. Listen to the music. Listen. That's Interrupted Fireworks. That's the song that plays when you go on the date, and it's really sentimental and emotional. And they chose it to play off Cait Shi? Don't you feel sad for the poor, poor robot cat? Don't you feel bad about getting angry at him for his betrayal? Aerith told him to be strong. Sure hope nothing bad happens to her. Remember Biggs? And Wedge? And Jesse? Where was their tearful send-off while they were each mortally wounded while trying to stop Shinra, the employers of this stupid, stupid robot cat, from murdering hundreds of innocent people? Carrying on. Cait Shi Mark II doesn't do much plot-wise until he assists with Barret's escape from Junon, while Avalanche are to be executed. But this is motivated by his opposition to capital punishment and his personal disdain for Scarlet. Then we get to the really galling part. After the party discovers the truth about the reason for Aerith's death, and that she was able to successfully use the holy materia, Diamond Weapon emerges and begins to head toward Midgar. Barret expresses concern for the safety of Marlene, and this is apparently too much for Cait Shi to hold in. He tears into Barret about his role in the bombing of Mako Reactor No. 1 and the innocent civilians who were killed in the ensuing explosion. As long as Marlene is safe, who cares about anyone else, right? Barret tries to justify this by stating that the few killed were justifiable sacrifices for the life of the planet, to which Cait Shi retorts, those few cared about their lives just as much as anybody else. Barret retorts he doesn't want to hear about that from someone who works for Shinra, which shuts Cait Shi up immediately. Tifa muddles that Barret realizes what the cost was to Avalanche's earlier activities, and that they effectively have to live with that. Put a pin in this, it's gonna be important later on. For now, let's talk about the big reveal. Let's talk about Reeve. Reeve is the head of urban planning and management, one of the 5 major departments of Shinra Inc. His position among the executive of Shinra grants him access to power and influence far beyond most other people on the planet. He's in the inner sanctum, so to speak. When the player is introduced to him for the first time, it is when he voices dissent toward the plan to destroy Sector 7. Heidegger jokes about this whole affair because he is a violent psychopath, but the president offers Reeve the chance to quit, which he does not take. Reeve, as Tifa later expresses, doesn't like being party to Shinra's evil, but feels that his position in the hierarchy can be justified because he isn't like the other executives. He has compassion and really cares for the people of Midgar. If he wasn't there, someone even worse would simply take his place, so he does what he can. Which is nothing. This is why I have such disdain for the character of Cait Shi/Reeve. He is the personification of the pearl-clutching bourgeoisie, whose heart bleeds for whomever they decide are the worthy victims of the system they perpetuate. Cait Shi excoriates Barret for having the gall to prioritize the safety of his daughter over the population of Midgar, a premise which falls apart the moment you look at it for more than a second. Consider that an enormous, genocidal monster is lumbering towards the city where your family lives. Is your immediate thought going to be, oh no, the citizenry? Or would it be, oh no, my family? Plus, it needs be repeated that at this point, Reeve still has Marlene and Elmira in his custody. The kidnapper and blackmailer has the gall to call out Barret? Here's the really important question. If Marlene had have been in Midgar, would Avalanche's actions have been any different? Of course not. They would have fought Diamond Weapon either way. Reeve mourns those killed by the bombing of Mako Reactor No. 1, but these are the only victims of violence he sees as worthy of justice. He never turns his indignation on himself for even a moment of self-reflection, for all the deaths he had been complicit in. Sector 7 is the most obvious, but we must also consider during his tenure the destruction of Corel, Gongaga, Nibelheim, and Wutai. These are also just the obvious ones. The long-term effects of Mako extraction must also be taken into consideration as well. Fundamentally, Reeve works exceptionally well as a representation of the reformist mantra, and why it will fail every time. Reeve, who we are told repeatedly cares about the people of Midgar, does little more than voice his opposition to the destruction of Sector 7. One word from the president, and he shuts up, utterly unable to stop the mass murder which unfolds. He is further stymied when he is unceremoniously told that Shinra will not rebuild Sector 7 as the company has shifted to renewing the Neo-Midgar project. Once again, his pleas go unheeded. When we explored the Marxist conceptualization of base and superstructure in Part 1, I discussed the idea that the superstructure generates the social and cultural basis to justify the existing base. As such, as Marxism is a key philosophical framework for the justification of socialism, the key philosophical framework for capitalism is liberalism. Liberalism holds that the pursuit of individual liberty is the highest moral good, and this liberty is tied materially to the establishment of the rights of ownership over private property. Neoliberalism, then, is a less fully developed philosophy and more a framework to rationalize the marketization of society under late capitalism. Neoliberalism's fundamental assertion is that capitalism is necessarily the only feasible economic system available, and that societal problems are best mitigated not by any intervention from the state, but by private enterprise catering to a specific demographic. Few would argue that the existing socio-economic reality of late capitalism is perfect, but that it is nevertheless the best choice available. Reformist attitudes to capitalism are doomed to fail because the system fundamentally functions through exploitative relationships. Let's say Sephiroth was to have assassinated the entirety of the Shinra executives and Reeve was the sole person left to control the company. Let's say he then disarmed the entirety of the Shinra security forces, dissolved the Turks, ended the soldier program, and scrapped their mechanical forces. What would then be left? Mako extraction and production would still remain as a threat to the continued existence of the planet. Reeve would be the friendliest accidental mass murderer in history, which would be a step up from President Shinra or Rufus, but still woefully short of being justifiable, let alone desirable. When Ketchi is exposed as a spy, Reeve voices his inability to understand AVALANCHE, and here we can observe that when he attempts to castigate Barret later on, he is really projecting his own guilt. Reeve cannot square AVALANCHE's altruistic goals with the vilification they receive, courtesy of Shinra, and their seemingly thankless task of saving the planet. Reeve, as much as he praises himself as the champion of the people of Midgar, is unable to grasp why people would band together and fight without reward. He can't imagine someone being motivated by something outside the system he benefits from, and his anger at Barret's seeming hypocrisy is just the manifestation of his own cognitive dissonance. Ketchi, Reeve, is not a totally lost cause, much as I personally dislike the character, and we'll explore how this pans out in the final part of this video. For now though, for most of the game really, Reeve is someone who benefits from the system, who wants to keep it going, but who also has the best of intentions. Unfortunately, the reality is far harsher than Reeve is willing to recognize. For those who are victims of the system, for those who have had their lives destroyed and everything taken from them, the sympathy Reeve expresses is too little, too late. Part 2. Dyne. The ethos of nihilism amounts to life having no inherent meaning or purpose. It's a slightly more complex philosophical position than this, but in popular usage, nihilism is associated with a profound sentiment of alienation and a despair. These emotions can then be channeled into a cycle of depression and violence, which author Bülent Diken refers to as radical nihilism. In this sense, spite is not a passive feeling, but an active will invested in this world. Concomitantly, pain and suffering are necessary to the spiteful actor in order to construct his subjectivity. This paradoxical subject is Nietzsche's radical, or suicidal, nihilist, who emerges with the death of God. The raw material of such nihilism is, in a nutshell, despair. A nihilist is a man who judges of the world as it is that it ought not to be. If the supreme values cannot find a place in this world, one can just as well destroy it. If we understand the Nietzschean concept of the death of God as the recognition that life without inherent meaning is not worth living, or that it cannot provide meaning, we can extrapolate this sentiment when we examine the worldview of a man who truly has nothing to live for. Dyne, a former resident of Corel and Barret's close friend growing up, was the only dissenting voice among the townsfolk of Corel when it came time to abandon their traditional economic base, the mining of coal. The vote went to a majority in favor of allowing Shinra to begin construction of the Corel reactor. Dyne had no choice but to watch as the traditional trade of his forebears was abandoned for the promise of a brighter future. We know what happened next. Dyne and Barret were both mutilated by Shinra troops, each losing an arm, albeit, on top of this, Dyne also plummeted to the bottom of a chasm. Barret, thinking his friend dead, managed to get back to the ruins of Corel, and while neither his wife Myrna nor Dyne's wife Eleanor survived, Dyne's daughter, Marlene, did. Dyne believed everyone he loved to be dead. Broken physically and psychologically, he swore vengeance upon Shinra. The player is not told explicitly what happens to Dyne between his fall and when he is encountered during the game, but there are enough contextual clues to piece together a few things. We know that Dyne has had the same surgery as Barret, had it earlier in fact, and by the same surgeon to boot. Dyne ascends in the criminal underworld around the Gold Saucer area, rising to become the boss of Corel Prison. We learn about Barret's own tragic past with Shinra, and that the survivors who now reside in North Corel blame him, uniquely, for what has happened. After the party visits the Gold Saucer and is introduced to Cait, they come across a massacre at the battle arena and discover it was committed by a man with a gun arm. Subsequently, they are blamed, arrested, and exiled to Corel Prison, where they confront Barret and learn more fully about the raising of Corel and the extent of Shinra's atrocity. Dyne is the embodiment of righteous, justified fury at the system which has robbed his life of all meaning and purpose. Dyne's rage toward the Shinra is completely justified, even more so than Barret, because he was Cassandra. He tried to warn the people of Corel, warn them all about just how much they would lose, and he was ignored. Resigned to a decision which was out of his hands, when the time came, his prescience didn't protect his loved ones, or even himself. Cold comfort to be the only man right, atop a pile of corpses. Dyne's rage can be sourced to Shinra, but his response was one of the deepest, most radical nihilism. Not content to destroy only Shinra, he kills indiscriminately, without rhyme or reason. In other words, Dyne has internalized the alienation inherent in the world the Shinra have created. Marx explains how the capitalist mode of production alienates the worker from the fruit of their labor. The capitalist mode of production, he argued, could not provide any sense of fulfillment on part of the worker, as the essence of themselves put into the object they produce was appropriated by whoever controlled the means of production. Therefore, the human propensity to produce beyond mere subsistence is robbed of its jouissance in the name of generating profit. Work, then, is robbed of any significance or meaning. It becomes a rote task, a modern means of subsistence. Taken further, this alienation could also be extrapolated to social relations and even life itself. Shinra has perpetuated this upon Dyne in every conceivable way. His pride as a miner, his home, his loved ones, all subsumed by Shinra. All they give us are artillery and stupid excuses. What's left is a world of despair and emptiness. Dyne's ultimate fate is death. It is all that is left for him, all that he can bring himself to do in a world without meaning. The very world he lives in is itself a grotesque mockery of the world as it ought to be, and he realizes his powerlessness to bring about that world. All he has is the relentless desire to reduce the world to nothing. A desire for total annihilation in the most literal sense animates his actions. This is made clear when he learns the truth about Marlene. The revelation that his only living connection to the life he once had is alive does nothing to shake his nihilism. It spurs it on even more. If Marlene is alive, then she too must be saved from this corrupt existence and reunited with her mother. This is more than Barret can take, and a boss fight is triggered. Mechanically, the boss fight is telling. Dyne only has a few attacks, but his special move is the Molotov cocktail, the IED of choice for dispossessed revolutionaries everywhere. Narratively, this fight has significant meaning for Barret, aside from the horror of having to fight his childhood friend, who by all rights should be fighting alongside him. Barret is brought face to face with the revolutionary violence he himself has carried out. Barret wins the fight, and some of the most poignant dialogue in the game occurs. Dyne recognizes all he has lost, but he doesn't know where he went wrong. Barret tries to plead with him to give Dyne a reason to go on, but Dyne rejects this outright. He has killed too many people to hold Marlene, because his hands are too covered with blood. For perhaps the first time in the game, the reality of what Barret himself has done in the name of stopping Shinra is brought to the fore. Dyne is a broken mirror of Barret, a grim reminder of the revolutionary path Barret has chosen to walk down. Dyne is a result of what happens when revolutionary action has no direction, has no ideology to guide it. Dyne is rage and violence against an unjust world, a world too far gone to be worth trying to save. In the end, all that is left is death. Barret laments that he hasn't got any more right to hold Marlene, but he does not succumb to his despair. He is given pause to reflect upon his own actions and perhaps remembers why he has to keep going. Barret, fundamentally, has something which Dyne did not. Part 3. The Immortal Science of the Study of Planet Life. The opening scene of Final Fantasy VII bookends very well with the closing scene. They are not mere images, but they are substantively reflective of one another. One of the more notable elements is the presence of the life stream. In the former, a tiny trickle in a back alley of Midgar. In the latter, as a torrent of the embodiment of the will of the planet to survive, Meteor. As much as these scenes begin and end the story, the brief clip of 500 years later notwithstanding, so too does the life stream ensconce the planet. Cosmo Canyon is a place of ideological significance in the world of Final Fantasy VII, as it is the birthplace of the study of planet life. This could be seen as a very spiritual, even religious place, and certainly the atmosphere is indicative of that. When the player first arrives, there is a guard at the gate of the village who asks if you are familiar with the land. And if you happen to have Barret in your party, he can barely hide his enthusiasm about finally arriving. The guard states that they have no room, but Red 13 vouches for the party, and you gain access to the village. If you wander around and talk to the NPCs, you will come to understand that many have come from all over the world to learn and study. These spiritual aspects aside, the materialist basis of the study of planet life is incontrovertible. Something even attested to by records in the library on the 62nd floor of Shinra Tower, as well as the video records of Professor Gast in Icicle Inn. The study of planet life is the scientific consensus for how the world operates, and so understanding the cycle of life and how it affects the material conditions of the inhabitants of the planet can provide instruction about how to respond to the environmental degradation which has been caused by Mako extraction, and, as the party will come to learn, the ultimate machinations of Genova and Sephiroth. Barret's responses among all the party members are the most significant, but I'll be exploring his experiences in the next section. With that in mind, one of the most profound affirmations comes when you gather with the party around Cosmo Candle, the large bonfire in the middle of the village, and Ket Shi simply reminisces about how long it has been and how it brings back memories. That's right. Reeve himself came to Cosmo Canyon to learn about the study of planet life, because again, it's both spirituality and science. The foundational knowledge about the existence of Lifestream and its fundamental characteristics would have been necessary to develop a technology like the Mako reactor. But, and this will be borne out in the long run, perhaps this is where Reeve also began to develop that seed of doubt about the exploitative nature of Mako energy and Shinra as a whole. The basics of the study of planet life are quite simple and are woven throughout the mechanics of the game, particularly combat. All living things, humans, animals, plants, and yes, even monsters, are material beings. Thus, when they die, their corporeal forms biodegrade and return to the planet. But their emotions, thoughts, and feelings are also material things, and so these aspects, called spirit energy, also return to the planet. The collective spirit energy of all living things flows and merges together to create a substratum of the planet called the life stream. When new life is created through natural processes, they are imbued with spirit energy and given life. One of the subtle mechanical ways this idea is reinforced during combat is that when you defeat an enemy, if they are living beings, Shinra troops, monsters, thieves, etc., their bodies turn transparent, take on a red or orange hue, and dissolve into the ground. If on the other hand they are mechanical, they turn transparent, break apart, and disintegrate. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, this highlights the importance of something which every good Marxist will want to spend hours talking to you about: theory. Again, we need to be a little abstract in our appreciation of the text as metaphor, but as we will see in the next section, this understanding of life on a systemic level can provide the necessary scientific and philosophic reasoning to motivate revolutionary action. This then parallels the function of Marxist theory in very significant ways. Marxist analysis, a critical theory like dialectical materialism, are argued by its proponents to not only be a philosophical mode of thought and analysis, but to be based on scientific observations. The materialist component of Marxism is central to the ideology, as it does not develop its analysis and conclusions about the nature of the world through reason alone, but also through material and historical analysis of human societies. Theory is paramount to developing class consciousness, and is a necessary precondition to proletarian revolution. Without understanding why the world is the way that it is, how historical developments have led to our current relations of production, accurately diagnosing the problem faced by workers is difficult, if not impossible. Put it another way, the bourgeoisie are able, because of their place in the superstructure, to develop and influence the culture which is produced. These cultural perspectives, or speaking more broadly, a worldview which reinforces the idea that the existing organization of society is both good and natural. This is something I discussed in part 3 of this video series. Therefore, in order for the proletariat to push back against the system as it exists, there needs to be an understanding of how the system functions and how it can be changed. Bugenhagen, the leader of Cosmo Canyon and the party's primary source of information about the study of planet life, is an enigmatic figure. It is never made clear if he is the originator of the study of planet life, or simply the current head disciple. His age is given as 130, and so it is probable that he developed the study of planet life himself, and then disseminated it from Cosmo Canyon. We learn later on, toward the end of Disc 2, once again through Cait, that Bugenhagen was once an employee of Shinra. Bugenhagen himself, while he is traveling with you aboard the Highwind, will talk about his love for machinery and technology. This should be obvious. After all, his observatory and laboratory are both mechanical. The entrance of the Cave of the G is opened through what appears to be a retina scan. Thus, the study of planet life is not a philosophy which rejects technology, but recognizes its importance to human civilization. For all his wisdom, for all the insight Bugenhagen has come to offer those who seek out the study of planet life, he has become a pessimist. Bugenhagen understands, perhaps better than anyone, that the process of Mako extraction is killing the planet. He is unsure of when it will happen. He states perhaps in 100 years, but is nevertheless certain that it will. He understands this because he is also able to hear the cries of the planet. And here they are again. Bugenhagen then perhaps best represents theory that is not put into direct practice. He is unable to take his analysis beyond his laboratory, and is only able to instruct others in the ideology. But even this is not a constant. Bugenhagen becomes intrigued when Red 13 informs him that Avalanche is fighting to save the planet from Shinra, but remains skeptical of their convictions. It is only after the events of the Cave of the G that he begins to shift from pessimism to optimism. And as we know later on, he becomes directly involved with Avalanche's efforts, utilizing his vast knowledge to discover that Aerith was successful in activating Holy, leaving them their last best hope against the apocalypse Shinra set in motion. In the face of overwhelming odds, of the material reality of one's existence, crushed under the weight of existential crisis and depressive systems, even the wisest among us can be lost to despair. Hope, the belief in a future which can be made better than one's current conditions, is a powerful thing. But hope, the belief in a future worth fighting for, combined with the theoretical basis upon which to develop solutions to the current state of the world, is even more powerful. It is in fact revolutionary. Part 4. The Revolutionary Ideology of Barret Wallace. Following the destruction of Corel, Barret leaves the ruins with the infant daughter of Dyne, Marlene, adopting her as his daughter. We are told he receives an artificial replacement limb for his arm, but soon enters into a deep depression. The specifics of his journey are never outlined, but we know he eventually finds his way to Sector 7, specifically the slums, where he meets with a man who is a student of the study of planet life, and the founder of Avalanche. It is through the exposure to the study of planet life, to theory, that Barret is able to develop an understanding for why the way the world is the way that it is, and an explanation for the injustice he and his loved ones have been made to suffer. Barret, through his learning about and adoption of the study of planet life as his theoretical basis for understanding the world, is able to channel his rage to more productive purposes and ends. We are not told about what happened to the original founder, only that he is, for whatever reason, no longer the leader of Avalanche. By the time the game begins, this mantle has been passed on to Barret. What Barret has is passion, vision, and drive. What he lacks are resources, but he makes do. Through his passion, he's able to recruit 4 additional people who will become his collaborators and form the new core of Avalanche: Tifa, Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse. With his vision, he is able to coordinate a plan of action in relatively short order. Using the infrastructure of Midgar, he and his comrades will infiltrate a successive number of Mako reactors around Midgar and destroy them. Utilizing his drive to overcome the fear and trepidation about meeting the violence brought against the citizenry of the planet by Shinra with his own righteous violence, enables him to act with the necessary clarity of purpose to carry out his rebellion. Remember that pin I told you about way back in part 1 of this video, where I was discussing Cait/Reeve's most damning criticisms of Barret? How he seemingly brushed off the deaths of the citizens of Midgar who were killed in the explosion of reactor number 1? Well, this is where we take it out of the board, because we need to talk about violence. There is only one method for settling disputes and establishing resolution between 2 competing parties in Final Fantasy VII, and it is combat. The entire mechanical basis for being able to advance in the narrative to further the plot, even something as simple as traveling from point A to point B, requires the player to engage in fighting. You fight all manner of opponents: robotic sentries, attack dogs, monsters, and yes, even humans. In fact, you fight a number of human enemies throughout your gameplay. Of the total bestiary of 288 enemy units to fight, 39 are humans. Now, this doesn't include Heidegger and Scarlet, so if we include them as well, that brings us to 41 of 290, or 14%. Of these humans, most are employees of Shinra Inc., and will be killed by the player if engaged in a fight. You do have the option to run away, use escape, or smoke bombs, equip the enemy away materia, or ride a chocobo of course, so this would limit you to boss battles. But let's be honest, this playtype may be a challenge run for veteran players, but it isn't how the game is normally played. Normally, you engage in combat to earn EXP, AP, Gil, and items to level up and purchase or find equipment for your party to advance the narrative. The only way to beat the game is through the combat system. It is the sole mechanism available to you as a player. Cait, if you use him in your main party, will also have to fight and kill fellow employees of Shinra Inc., so his feigned disdain at Barret's violent methods are hypocritical and hollow. Now, you may say, Cait isn't talking about what amounts to military opponents or targets, but rather innocent civilians who have nothing to do with the affairs of Shinra Inc., and who were just living their lives and were caught up in the explosion and perished. These, the people of Midgar, are the worthy victims of the terrorist actions of Avalanche, and this makes Barret just as much of a hypocrite, just as guilty as Shinra. So, I could make a case that those killed in the blast were almost certainly residents of Midgar who lived on the upper plate of Sector 1. The people who may not have engaged in direct violence against, say, the residents of the slums, but through the system they willingly participated and supported, were nevertheless committing indirect violence by making the slums less and less habitable for its residents. But I'm not going to do this, because I don't have to. I do not need to defend Barret, or Avalanche for that matter, for the collateral damage caused by the opening bombing mission. Because, through the narrative of the game, the characters come to understand that this kind of adventurism, attacking the infrastructure instead of Shinra directly, was the wrong way to go about things. Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse sacrificed their lives trying in vain to stop the destruction of the Sector 7 pillar, and with their dying breaths express remorse for the civilians their actions have killed. Barret expresses his regret multiple times throughout the game, but perhaps no more poignantly than when he has to fight Dyne, and is forced to confront the violence he has used in his rebellion against Shinra Inc. Later on, as much as he tries to brush off Ketchi's criticism, this is done more out of gall than sincerity. Again, Tifa voices that Barret, and by proxy, Cloud and herself, regret their actions. This is confirmed at the end of Disc 2 when Barret states, Reeve, on the other hand, never apologizes for anything Shinra does. He never admits culpability or complicity in any of the atrocities Shinra has committed, nor for willingly turning a blind eye to what the Mako reactors were doing to the planet. He sits in judgment of the people who are fighting to save the world from a company he has had a significant hand in shaping and running, and he never even provides a mea culpa. Barret, on the other hand, experiences some of the most significant character growth of any of the members of Avalanche. We begin the narrative with him as the gruff, ideological leader, but who gradually comes to take a back seat to other party members. Cloud, obviously, but even to Tifa and Sid. He relinquishes his leadership role when members who are better suited to leading are understood to be capable enough to do so. Barret, especially after the tragedy in Midgar and the events in the Gold Saucer and Corel prison, begins to doubt even his mission. By the time the party reaches Cosmo Canyon, he states that Avalanche was finished, which lasts for about 15 seconds before he declares it reborn again. Those on the revolutionary path may come to question their methods and their efficacy, and this can lead to doubt. But Barret never abandons his commitment to the study of planet life. In fact, through his effort and demonstration by Bugenhagen, the player is also exposed to the ideology and comes to accept it for the truth that it is. Barret also never lets go of the other aspect which drives him, his righteous anger. He questions it, certainly, but he never really lets it go. I mean, his ultimate weapon is called the missing score. It's overt. It's also interesting that of all the ultimate weapons, Barret's alone operates on mastery of materia, something he didn't even know how to use at the beginning of the game. Barret's rage is something which is brought up again and again as a negative. At the end of Disc 2, when each member of Avalanche is trying to discover their reason for fighting, Barret comes to the conclusion that, as cool as it sounds to say that his goal was to save the planet, he was more motivated by his desire for revenge against Shinra. Oh, and the small detail about securing a future for Marlene. This is one of those instances where the game tries to make a point about altruism, but when you consider it, isn't a very strong one. The game seemingly wants the player to accept that Barret is somehow wrong to have a personal stake in the future of the planet, and that if his motivation is not purely saving the planet, then this somehow taints his mission. Barret, as the idealist revolutionary, must sublimate his own desires and motivations and be driven by pure altruism to be justified, and anything less validates the craven criticism of Reeve. But this just doesn't make any sense, at least not from a Marxist perspective. Barret has his theoretical basis for his beliefs and his actions, but he is not trapped by his ideology, which is what the game seems to want to happen. Rather, it is because the study of planet life is the correct theoretical approach that it can be adapted to accommodate when the circumstances change. On a fundamental level, Barret is justified in his desire for revenge against Shinra, and he is justified in wanting to let Marlene have a life. Barret pursuing these goals to their logical ends will result in the planet being saved, regardless of whether he has a self-interested basis motivating his actions. The material reality trumps ideology. This is important because if someone becomes too invested in their ideology without taking the time to refine it or to let it develop organically as it is put into practice, then you can easily become trapped in an ideological prison. Those who can become trapped in their ideology and find themselves in a time of crisis can then use it to justify all manner of beliefs and commit the most horrendous of atrocities. Part 5. Weapon. One of the more common responses to the existential dread which proceeds from late capitalism directly relates to one of the most significant material aspects of everyone's life: the environment. The environmentalist themes of Final Fantasy VII are very overt. Avalanche has been labeled an eco-terrorist organization since the game launched, after all. The narrative of the game is explicit about Shinra acknowledging the environmental degradation it has and continues to cause, and carrying on in spite of this because it is more profitable than stopping. So what happens when the threat to the planet is so strong that it triggers what amounts to its immune system? We first learn about weapon and what we later come to understand as weapon, diamond weapon, ultima weapon, ruby weapon, and emerald weapon when the player arrives in Icicle Inn and is able to view the video of Professor Gast and Ifalna. The weapons are the ultimate defense system of the planet, released when the threat to the planet is so great that its very life is in danger. When the player is in the center of the northern crater, you can actually see weapon encased inside a wall of materia. Based on its location in the stratum, Ifalna states that weapon was created to counteract the presence of Genova when it arrived on the planet 2,500 years ago. This would also track with the fact that the Cetra alone had any record of them, since this was the defining event in the history of their people. The weapons are released in spectacular fashion, immediately after Sephiroth is able to summon Meteor, and they waste no time in beginning their grim work of wiping out all human civilization. It appears when the planet is in danger, reducing everything to nothingness. A question though, are they? Are we observing weapon indiscriminately attacking all human habitation, or do they have a particular target in mind? Barret and Tifa are accidentally saved when weapon attacks Junon, but Junon is one of Shinra's strongholds. We learn later on that a weapon shoots the Galnica aircraft out of the sky. This happens before you raid the underwater reactor, so it must have been Diamond Weapon. Midgar, when it is finally attacked, is bombarded by Diamond Weapon. Ultima Weapon is an outlier, as the only time it attacks is when the lifestream swells under Midil, but then it constantly hovers over cities and towns, the northern cave and Wutai notwithstanding, which all have Mako reactors. I'd make the case that the weapons are primarily targeting Shinra centers of power. However, I do acknowledge that this may just be me reading too much into it. Weapon, as I alluded to earlier, can be seen as the immune system responding to a sickness that threatens the life of the planet. So what is the sickness? Who is responsible for the environmental degradation? Who is causing the planet to cry out in pain? One of the curious reactionary positions which has become more significant during late capitalism, spurred on by the inevitability of ecological collapse caused by anthropogenic climate change, is commonly referred to as eco-fascism. It's more of a critical label than a self-identified or particularly robust political position, but it refers primarily to the idea that human civilization, the human species itself, is the existential threat to the Earth being able to sustain life. Frequently, eco-fascist ideology manifests in seemingly innocuous, common sense ideas. The most common of these arguments relates to the capacity of the Earth to sustain an ever-increasing number of humans, the so-called problem of overpopulation. The argument is deceptively simple. The Earth is finite, and so has a finite amount of resources. Because of this, eventually the human population will reach a point where the Earth can no longer sustain that population. This will necessarily trigger an ecological collapse which will be so catastrophic that the continued survival of not only human civilization, but life on Earth is brought into doubt. I'm sure it's not hard to think of examples from media, or perhaps even conversations you've had with your peers, where offhanded remarks about overpopulation have been mentioned. More broadly, the sentiment that humans are uniquely harmful to the Earth is quite common. Admittedly, there is good reason to think this way. The reality of anthropogenic, that is, human-caused, climate change is incontrovertible. The conclusion many draw from this is that humans are therefore a blight on the Earth. Humans are the virus. And perhaps, if there weren't so many people milling about, that life would be better all around. It's a finite pie, so fewer mouths to feed means everyone gets more pie. You can see the simple and easy appeal, but what you may not see is the unspoken part, which is the solution to the problem of overpopulation. And the solution is genocide. This is where fascism enters the discussion, because the way you solve the environmental degradation caused by too many people is to reduce the number of people. For the Earth to survive, a whole lot of people need to stop consuming the precious, finite resources and polluting the environment. The thing is that, typically, this line of reasoning comes from the most developed countries, the ones who have stagnant or receding population growth. It is the Third World, the Global South, which has rampant population growth, and therefore it is these populations which need to be culled, or so the argument goes. But here's the thing. This argument is based on a flawed interpretation of what finite resources actually entails. The truth of the matter is that it isn't a problem of there not being enough to go around. It is a problem of distribution. There is, for example, enough food produced globally to end hunger and starvation. The problem is that this is not profitable. In a similar vein, industrial production under the capitalist mode of production is based on the production of commodities to generate profit for a few, not to meet the needs of the many. Ecofascism, then, is yet another example of capitalism asserting itself as the natural state of the world, and people developing erroneous conclusions based on this naturalization. Ever-increasing production geared towards generating the most profit, regardless of the environmental impact, is more important than sustaining the habitability of the planet. And some people criticize the depiction of Shinra for being too on the nose. Return to the narrative and that central question of the nature of humanity. Bugenhagen states, early on, that even if Avalanche were to be able to stop all the Mako reactors, the planet would still die. Even if they stopped Sephiroth, the planet would still perish. The thing is, Bugenhagen is wrong. I mean, that's fine. It's okay to be wrong, and Bugenhagen is right about most things. But on this, he let his pessimism get the better of him. In the scene which rolls after the credits, which depicts events happening 500 years into the future, we watch as Red 13 and his children race across a plain, which turns out to be the fields around Kham. They climb to the top of a cliff and emerge to see what is left of the ruins of Midgar. Midgar is a skeleton of its former self, overgrown with vegetation and absent of any signs of human habitation. So, hey, the planet survived well past Bugenhagen's guess of 100 years. Now, there is a tendency in certain media to leave things open-ended, and so we are left to wonder if humanity was wiped out along with Meteor. It's kinda bleak. That is until you hear the unmistakable laughter of children. I believe this, accompanied by the entire weight of the narrative and how much of a direct role humans played in saving the planet, that it would be wrong to interpret humans as ultimately being bad for the planet. But so too can we see that without the overthrow of the system of exploitation and environmental degradation, addressing the symptoms without addressing the root cause is useless. We know emphatically where the true crisis for the planet originated from, and we also know who stopped it. Before we get to our conclusion, however, we need to take a slight detour. A side quest, if you will. Part 6. Materia Hunter Yuffie. I've already discussed at length the war with Wutai, but it's important we return now to explore just what the fallout of the war had upon the citizenry of the town, and how this has affected its leadership and their children. The party is able to first encounter Yuffie Kisaragi after clearing the mithril mines and entering any of the forested areas nearby and entering a fight. This is again a case where the mechanical elements of the game really hammer home how to understand the character. Yuffie is the only party character you are provided an opportunity to fight with, and why not? She is, after all, a member of a culture who has been colonized by Shinra. And so anyone she would encounter outside of Wutai could be considered an enemy. Given that Shinra relied upon an army of conscripts from across the towns under their control, she wouldn't necessarily be wrong. Yuffie's plan is simple, but fundamentally misguided, because it is the plan of a child. Collect as much materia as possible, and use it to empower the people of Wutai to once more rise up and oppose Shinra. On the face of it, it seems strange. Materia is, after all, widely available. It isn't as if it is a luxury good either, because even the shops in the Midgar slums carried it for purchase. If you first encounter and recruit Yuffie as early as possible, the only noticeably rare materia which you may have found would be the Chocomog summon. And yes, you could include the enemy skill here as well, especially if you've collected beta from the Midgar Zalem, but I digress. Well, when you have ready access to something, it can quickly lose its novelty and can easily be taken for granted. The people of Wutai do not have access to materia, and so Yuffie steals yours. Suddenly, after spending hours utilizing and relying on materia, on the magic powers, fantastical creatures, and stat boosts it grants the player, you don't have it anymore. You've lost a vital part of your ability to fight, and you are simply unable to continue. I mean that literally. Once your materia is stolen, you are locked into the event until you recover them. Think about what you, as the player, have been able to accomplish up to this point. All the random encounters, all the boss fights, and at each turn, you've gone toe-to-toe with Shinra and come out on top. This is all possible because you are able to rely on materia. And so perhaps Yuffie's plan is not as childish as it first seemed. When you manage to get to Wutai, you may notice things are a little off, at least compared to every other town you may have visited. This is probably the first town you really felt like an outsider, excepting maybe the creepily rebuilt Nibelheim. And you can almost feel the contempt the townsfolk have for you. The weapon shop, for example, will not sell you anything until after you have recovered your materia. One of the endearing effects of imperialism and the colonialism which necessarily follows is that the colonized come to resent their oppressors. In late capitalism, this manifests itself differently than it had in earlier stages of capitalist development. Instead of physically occupying a region and directly subjugating the population, capitalist states are simply able to extract wealth from a region through less overt mechanisms of control, like, say, denying them access to materia. As I discussed at length in Part 2, the surface level for the invasion of Wutai was that Shinra wanted to build a Mako reactor. It is never spelled out precisely in the game where the Mako reactor was to be built, but on Da Chao Mountain would certainly be the most likely place. This, of course, was unacceptable to Godo and the citizens of Wutai, so war broke out. Later in the game, if you manage to complete the Pagoda side quest, you'll learn from Godo that he also wanted the war, because he believed he could defeat Shinra. Thus, the defeat was even more of a blow to the town's leadership and traditions. You first meet Godo while he is sleeping in his home, and he is initially dismissive of his daughter, claiming he has never even heard of her. This is the point where Yuffie emerges from hiding and scolds her father. He solemnly returns to his room and asks that you leave, as he does not want to risk the safety of Wutai by opposing Shinra. Here is a man who has no illusions about the harsh reality of the world that a pugnacious brat like Yuffie cannot understand. There's actually a neat little narrative parallel here between Yuffie and Cloud. At some point in their youths, they sought to sublimate their feelings of weakness by getting into brawls, and each would eventually leave their respective homes to seek a way to redress their feelings of powerlessness. But I digress. Yuffie, while still a child when the war broke out, as a teenager still remembers a time when she idealized her father and Wutai, and is sickened by the sorry state of their present. Yuffie also resents you, the player, and your party, because she, initially at least, mistakenly believes that your goals and hers are opposed. However, this begins to change as she travels with you. Her plan remains the same, and she carries it out to devastating effect. However, when she is forced to confront her father, she states that you are actually standing up and opposing Shinra. During the events of the Wutai side quest, you end up saving her, and so while she sheepishly returns your materia, she nevertheless plans on trying to take it again, although in fairness, she never does. The events in the Pagoda side quest are also revealing. While Yuffie participates in 5 duels against increasingly strong opponents, the player can come to appreciate the power which these residents of Wutai have. As it turns out, Yuffie is forced to fight her own father, who is naturally a boss. Mechanically, the game is expressing that the people of Wutai still have power, even without the benefit of materia. They simply have lost the will to use that power to effect change, and it takes Yuffie to shake them out of their complacency to see that they can stand and fight. Yuffie, who recognizes that the culture and traditions of her people are worth protecting and preserving, but without the willingness to fight their oppressors, the people of Wutai may as well abandon them to become the tchotchkes of the tourists they host. The lesson that Yuffie comes to understand after traveling with your party, with Avalanche, and participating in the struggle against Shinra, is that she does not have the power to do it alone, that the people of Wutai alone will not be able to achieve it either. It will take a united effort to oppose and overthrow the imperialist dominance of Shinra. It needs to be pointed out, however, that Yuffie is not a passive voice in this understanding. She comes to recognize that the best, perhaps the only way to fight Shinra is as a part of your group. She makes that decision, then she convinces her father and her people that the struggle is possible and worth risking to secure a future. Her goals remain the same, the liberation of the people of Wutai. Her final line in the game is about never giving up the hunt for materia, but she recognizes that the best way to do this is through the revolution Avalanche is leading. The support of Wutai is not something which would have been possible without her. The party cannot advance past the first floor of the pagoda unless Yuffie is in the party, and Yuffie has to be sufficiently leveled up to be able to reach the top and defeat her father. Your party, your fight against Shinra, is made stronger for having Yuffie as a comrade. The people of Wutai would not have once again opposed Shinra without her presence, and she would not have gained the strength and understanding to stand up to her father without you. During the struggle against capital, against the imperialist forces which seek to subjugate the world, workers from all cultures must come together, united in their struggle, because only through cooperation and mutual assistance can hegemony be overthrown. Part 7. What a Crew. Minutes after the party discovers the body of the executed President Shinra, they come face to face with his replacement, his son Rufus. He asks who each of the party members are and receives the following responses. An ex-soldier, 2 members of Avalanche, a flower girl from the slums, and a research specimen. As the narrative progresses, the party will also be joined by a ninja, a former Turk, a pilot, and a class traitor. These are a cadre of the dispossessed, who come together in a singular purpose, to overthrow Shinra. Each party member has suffered from Shinra on an individual level, but if we abstract this onto the inhabitants of the planet as a whole, the systemic nature of Shinra's oppression can be observed, and it reaches everywhere. The response Avalanche represents is one of the proletarian revolution against capital. I've already spoken at length about Barret, but he can be understood to represent what Lenin called the revolutionary vanguard, the ideologically committed and motivated spear tip who would lead the broader proletarian revolution against the forces of the oppressive state they were rebelling against. This is the core narrative function Barret serves. He established Avalanche and recruited Tifa, who brings in Cloud, and as the game progresses, others flock to the banner and the cause. Through the narrative, he is forced to confront his own past mistakes and gradually cedes leadership to other members of the party. Tifa Lockhart is already a member of Avalanche when the narrative begins, and I think this is something that gets overlooked. Her character becomes subsumed because of her relationship to Cloud, but it should not be forgotten that her motivations go beyond her affection for our spiky-haired protagonist. Tifa watched as her town was burned to the ground and found her father murdered by Sephiroth. On top of this, she also suffered a grievous injury at the hands of Sephiroth. She survived because of her own strength, and the rapid medical aid performed by her mentor, Zangan. Tifa is brought to Midgar because of her need for medical aid. She makes a full recovery, and importantly, joins Avalanche. Tifa's motivations are not far removed from Barret's, having experienced similar trauma at the hands of Shinra. Ultimately, Tifa's reasons are the most personal. She continues the fight because she wants to stay by Cloud's side. Cloud Strife is a mentally unstable survivor of the Nibelheim incident, only recently escaped from the captivity of Shinra. Cloud, as a youth, became swept up in the propaganda Shinra produced to encourage young people to join their military forces. His dreams of becoming a soldier were dashed. He couldn't make the cut, and so he became a low-level private in the Shinra army. During the Nibelheim incident, his mother is killed in the fire caused by Sephiroth's rampage. What's more, his friend Zack, a soldier who just obtained the rank of first class, and Cloud's childhood friend Tifa are both grievously injured by Sephiroth. Cloud, through the sheer force of will, is able to kill Sephiroth after himself being impaled by throwing his assailant into the open pool of lifestream within the Mount Nibel Mako reactor. He is captured by Shinra and is used as a human test subject for the Reunion Project. Cloud is recruited by Avalanche as a mercenary, but he maintains his association because of Tifa and his discovery that Sephiroth is still alive. However, as a result of the experiments performed on him, Cloud's mind is nearly destroyed, and he spends the first 2/3 of the game acting under a delusion about his past. Because of this, Cloud almost kills Aerith, and Sephiroth is able to manipulate Cloud into giving him the black materia. Tifa is able to help Cloud discover his true self while they are both submerged in the lifestream, and he is able to square his past with his present. Cloud's ultimate motivations are to settle the score with Sephiroth and to save the planet. Aerith Gainsborough is the biological daughter of Professor Gast, who was murdered by Shinra when she was an infant, and Ifalna, who was the last descendant of the Cetra before Aerith's birth. Ifalna was killed by Shinra after she succumbed to her wounds during her escape from a research facility. Aerith is raised by Elmira Gainsborough, herself a widow whose husband was killed in action during the war with Wutai. Aerith, a resident of the Sector 5 slums, is poor. She manages to get by through selling flowers she cultivates to the residents of the Upper Plate in Midgar. Aerith lives under constant surveillance, and is eventually abducted by Shinra to restart the Neo-Midgar project. She is rescued by Avalanche and joins them to discover her own past and connection with the Cetra. Aerith does not live to see Avalanche achieve its victory over Shinra, nor in putting an end to Sephiroth, but her sacrifice gives them the one chance they need. No one ever said the revolution would be without cost. Red 13 is a research specimen, captured by Shinra at some point and used in further experimentation. He is originally a resident of Cosmo Canyon and initially travels with Avalanche to get back to his hometown. It is during the events of the Cosmo Canyon, following the clearance of the Cave of the Gi, that his grandfather, Bugenhagen, convinces Nanaki, his real name, to join Avalanche to do all he can for the planet. Nanaki's aims are to grow strong enough to defend the people of Cosmo Canyon, and this necessitates he work towards overthrowing the greatest threat to the planet, Shinra. I've also already talked at length about Yuffie Kisaragi, so I'll be brief. Yuffie joins to further her own ends. As a child, she witnessed the defeat of her people at the hands of the Shinra army, and what happened to her village in the wake of that defeat. Thus, she is motivated primarily by a desire to restore the dignity of the people of Wutai, and to this end, she seeks out a definite source of power, materia. Through her travels with Avalanche, Yuffie comes to appreciate the dedication Avalanche has in opposing Shinra. She also comes to understand that mutual cooperation engendered by being a member of the party is the best path forward to achieving her goals, the liberation of her people. Ketchi, yes, even Reeve gets a redemption arc. He is, after all, also a member of the party. Reeve's motivations are conflicted from the get-go. He seeks justice against Avalanche for the civilian casualties of the No. 1 Mako reactor, and so volunteers as a spy to infiltrate the group. He compartmentalizes the atrocities Shinra has committed to justify his own efforts to sabotage Avalanche, but through his continued presence in the party, begins to understand that Shinra, is in the wrong. The breaking point occurs when he is unable to convince Heidegger and Scarlet to help stop Hojo and save Midgar, and he is placed under arrest. This is when Reeve transitions from bourgeoisie infiltrator to class traitor, and becomes ideologically committed to the overthrow of Shinra, something both Marx and Lenin discussed as an inevitable part of a proletarian revolution. Ultimately, Reeve wants to protect the people of Midgar, and to make amends for the suffering he was complicit in as a Shinra executive. Vincent Valentine, a former member of the Turks, was murdered by Hojo. Yes, he was murdered. He didn't just get knocked unconscious. Hojo killed him, and then was reanimated in one of his twisted experiments. Failing to have stopped Hojo and Lucretia's decision to volunteer their child to the Genova Project, and unable to save Lucretia herself, Vincent remains in the basement of the Shinra mansion until he is discovered by Avalanche, upon their reaching the rebuilt Nibelheim. Vincent's motivations revolve around setting right the mistakes he made in the past, and seeks to bring justice to Hojo and, by proxy, Shinra. Sid Highwind is probably the most overtly proletarian figure in the game, even though his motivation appears to be the shallowest, so to speak. Sid is initially recruited not because of some past trauma or violence committed against him. His reason is directly grounded in his material conditions. Shinra took away his opportunity to become an astronaut, then confiscated his ship, the Highwind, and at the time you meet him, they are even trying to steal his plane, the Tiny Bronco. Rufus's rationale is that all of these things belong to Shinra, despite the appearance that Sid himself had a significant role in their construction and maintenance. And so Sid joins because he is no longer willing to let Shinra rob his life of the only thing he seems to value. Sid is certainly the least ideologically motivated of all members initially, but because of his access to technologically necessary equipment, like the Highwind airship, he is nevertheless valued. During the narrative of the game, Sid attains his lifelong dream of traveling into outer space, and his experiences of seeing the planet from a wholly new perspective finally hammer home the reality of the study of planet life, and that if Avalanche won't fight for the planet, then no one else will. Avalanche then can be understood to represent the proletarian struggle against the bourgeoisie system which Shinra engenders. Each party member has their own reason for opposing Shinra, caused by the oppression, the exploitative nature that Shinra has used to attain global hegemony. Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto that the bourgeoisie will furnish the proletarian with the weapons which will bring about its own destruction. He was speaking metaphorically, but in the case of Final Fantasy VII, it is both metaphor, insomuch as Shinra provided the catalyst for Avalanche to come into existence through its cruelty, as well as literally, because Shinra manufactures both the weapons and the materia, vital material goods necessary for armed uprising. Final Fantasy VII's player characters, the people whose stories and fates we as the player experience, are those of the working class. There are no royals, no long-lost prodigal princesses, who have to discover their lost secret destiny to be found. With the obvious exception of Reeve, and even his persona of Cait can be seen as a worker of sorts. No, I'm still not going to feel sad for Cait Mark I. Aerith, you could make a case, may be exceptional, as she is more a person of destiny than any of the other party members. However, her material conditions and place within the hierarchy of the system Shinra built does not afford her any special place. If anything, she was to be exploited in a very literal sense. What I'm getting at here is that everyone who is a member of Avalanche is a normal person, not of noble blood or rank. These are people who were living their lives, getting along as best as they could, but who suffered loss and violence at the hands of Shinra, and so were motivated into rebellion against their oppressor. These are individuals who are swept up in the grand tide of history, born into a system they had no say in or control over. And yet, when they do come together, when they unite their individual struggles against Shinra into a consolidated effort and fight, they are able to achieve amazing things. Final Fantasy VII is, perhaps more than any other entry in the series, both the most overtly political and the most focused on the destiny of the proletariat. It is something which is sorely missing in most of the media which we consume. The idea that regular people, when they come together, can accomplish great things, can change the world, is a message which is desperately needed. In the face of overwhelming adversity and hopelessness, something we all face living through late capitalism, it is through solidarity, in being united against the ravages of capitalism, that we can find our own hope for a future without it, for a more fair and just world to come. What begins as a rebellion against an evil corporation becomes much more, and what erupts goes beyond imagination. I hope you enjoyed this video, and this video series. It's been an idea I've had kicking around for a long time, and I'm glad at least a few folks will get the chance to engage with it and some of the ideas that I've put forward. A few folks who were helpful enough to provide some feedback pointed out that it's such an obvious reading. The anti-capitalist messaging in Final Fantasy VII is pretty overt if you've been exposed to even a modicum of leftist theory. Surprisingly, I wasn't able to find anything like it on YouTube. Still, given that the game came out in 1997, during the long nadir of leftist, socialist, Marxist, and general anti-capitalist thought in North America, it's still sort of surprising that it was as popular as it was here. Given the trajectory of history, however, the reality of climate change and a looming environmental apocalypse, the message of the game is certainly something which has only become more relevant with age. There are, of course, limits to what you can read into a text. To be perfectly clear, my intention of these videos as a Marxist reading should not be taken as an assertion that this is the way to interpret the game. After all, it wasn't as if the dev team were all MLMs concocting communist propaganda to indoctrinate the youth. This becomes apparent in the way some aspects are framed, but especially when you take the text into consideration as a component of a much larger whole. I avoided the compilation's material specifically to not lose the narrative set out in the original game. As I mentioned all the way back in part 1, I do plan on looking at the compilation's material in a subsequent video, because through fleshing out a lot of the backstory elements which are not present in the original English language version of Final Fantasy VII, the text of the original game is fundamentally changed. As much as I use the text of Final Fantasy VII to explore some concepts of Marxist analysis, I believe the compilation's material will be very useful in exploring the concept of recuperation. But that's going to be down the line. I'll be taking a break from Final Fantasy VII related content for the next little while. So I hope those of you who have become subscribers like what I have in store. As always, if you have any questions or feedback, please comment below. If you like this video and think it is merited, please give it a like. If you're intrigued by my teasing upcoming videos and want to see what I put out next, subscribe to the channel. If you really want to, you could hit the little notifications bell, share the videos as well. Thanks for your time.